On this day, every year, Britain remembers the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis. The deliberate attempt to exterminate an entire community is a chilling lesson from history. And here at Guildhall in London, 200 survivors are among those gathered for this year's commemoration. Each has a powerful story to tell. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we also remember genocides elsewhere: Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. And human beings' capacity to hate is even seen in Britain, where research released today suggests 1 in 10 people has been the victim of a hate incident or crime. Today, candles will be lit in memory of those persecuted and killed in the Holocaust and since. Their fate is a reminder not only of the horrors, but of where hate and racism can lead.
First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist.
Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist.
Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist.
Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew.
Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me.
Welcome to this commemoration marking Holocaust Memorial Day, one of many events taking place across the country, and a special welcome to the survivors of the Holocaust and those who've survived more recent genocides. We are all here to remember the 6 million Jews who were exterminated by the Nazis in a planned, industrialized slaughter. 1.5 million of whom were children and babies. Others, millions of others, including Romanies, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled people, were all targeted and murdered. We also remember the genocides that have taken place in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. The Holocaust threatened the very fabric of civilization, yet the road that led to the horrors of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor began years earlier. Historian David Olusoga returned to Bergen-Belsen to trace the path of escalation that resulted in the scenes that so shocked the world at the end of the Second World War and are still shocking us all today.
When the British Army arrived here in 1945, they found a camp that was overcrowded with tens of thousands of starving and dying people. A camp that had been completely overwhelmed by disease, and perhaps most shockingly, a camp that had already become one vast open-air cemetery. There were thousands upon thousands of bodies piled up across the camp. What the British soldiers who'd arrived here had stumbled across was a place that finally revealed the full scale of Nazi barbarism. Those liberated by the Allies across Europe in 1945 were survivors of the brutal concentration and extermination camps established throughout Nazi-occupied countries. Barbarous institutions where millions of people had been sent to be worked to death or to be killed immediately upon arrival. For millions of people, places like Treblinka, Sobibor and Auschwitz represented the final phase in a nightmare that had begun back in 1933 when Hitler came to power. From the early days of the Nazi regime, anti-Semitism was actively and openly encouraged. Perhaps the most significant moment in the pre-war persecution of the Jews of Germany was Kristallnacht, the anti-Jewish riots of November 1938. Following a night of barbaric state-sponsored violence and vandalism, laws were passed banning Jews from owning businesses, from attending schools, and eventually from public life altogether. If you were a Jew living under Hitler, the list of things you couldn't even own constantly expanded. A Jew, for example, couldn't own a radio or a telephone or a bicycle, or even a newspaper or a bottle of milk. By the end of 1941, this oppression was sealed with the enforcement of the Judenstern. Every Jew over the age of 6 was forced to wear a yellow star. Having been robbed of their livelihoods and their professions, the Jews now lost their homes. They were transported to ghettos, special compounds that were built right across the occupied areas. As the net of Nazi persecution widened across Europe, more Jews became trapped. Hundreds of thousands died of disease and starvation. However, even this form of slow, agonizing suffocation was not the limit of Nazi inhumanity. Execution squads were used to speed up the extermination of those deemed impure by the Third Reich. But it was decided that these methods were simply not efficient enough, and now the Nazis began to look for an industrial solution to their Jewish question. The decision had been made to finally deliver on the ambition of annihilating the Jews of Europe. Camps were used as centres for death, to obliterate not just their lives, but their faith, their culture, their history. This is a significant place in lots of ways, but its significance in the story of the Holocaust is that it was the images taken here, the films and the photographs that were taken here, that define and give us the image, the reality of what the Holocaust was. This is one of those places that define the modern age. It's one of those places that I think is contaminated by history. Too much happened here. Too much misery and suffering took place on this spot for it ever to be anything other than a warning to us of what lies within us and what can happen if we're not watchful.
I'm Susan Pollock. In 1944, the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators organized the deportation of Hungarian Jews and others. In less than 2 months, from late February, almost all Jews were deported, mostly to Auschwitz-Birkenau. My father was imprisoned before and murdered. Then my mum and my brother Lotzi and myself, 13 years old, were ordered into a ghetto, then to a large camp, not being resettled as rumors tried to delude us, but to Auschwitz on a cattle train. Crying and praying were the only sounds heard, and the only consoling mantra for us. We were abandoned. On arrival, we scrambled out and selection took place. I was separated from my mum, who was sent with the elderly and many children. The shouting and the violent aggression began the process of dehumanization. I learned of the gas chamber where my mum's group was taken. My emotions seized up and the experience shut me down, shut me off from the world. I survived as a robot. From there, I was used as a slave laborer in Guildhall, Germany. With the advance of the Allies, we were sent on a death march in the bitter cold, over frozen fields, to a place of death, Bergen-Belsen. On the fateful day of the 15th of April, 1945, the British Army liberated us. I managed to crawl out, and they gently picked me up and placed me in a clean bed. How do you get over such an experience? There was no revenge. There was no justice. I chose to walk away and rebuild my life in the hope of a just and hate-free future for all of us. Thank you.
And now the choir of Clare College, Cambridge, will sing William Byrd's Civitas Sancti Tui. 6 memorial candles, to be lit later in the ceremony, will be brought in by young people working with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust to continue the legacy of the survivors.
Everything we've heard happened because cultured, educated Europe allowed this evil ideology to take root. Some actively supported the regime, but far more people silently stood by in the face of what was happening around them. Some afraid to speak out. Some mainly indifferent. But a few brave people refused to be bystanders and would not accept that some people's lives were deemed to be worth less than others. And one person who took a stance was Frank Foley, a British diplomat who was also an MI6 agent working in Berlin. Liable for arrest at any time, he ignored the rules to help countless Jews escape from Nazi Germany. Among them, Judy Field and Werner Lachs.
We left Cologne in June 1939. It was just about 2.5 months before the war started. I was 12 and a half.
I left with my mother and brother. I think it was July 1939. When I left Berlin, I was 7 years old.
As far as I'm concerned, Frank Foley saved our lives. There's no doubt at all in my mind.
By the end of Hitler's first year in power, an estimated 65,000 Germans had fled the country. The vast majority of them were Jewish. Frank Foley worked secretly, behind the scenes, to help as many as 10,000 Jews to escape the rising climate of fear and persecution.
Kristallnacht changed everything. Jewish people were queuing outside embassies to try and get visas.
Here they were only too happy to get rid of the Jews, but they wanted the Jews to pay for it as well. My family didn't have money, and I suppose it was very difficult to do all that and to get all that together.
At great personal risk, Frank Foley broke the rules to grant visas without the required financial guarantees. He worked around the clock to answer thousands of requests from people who were desperate to get out of Germany.
I remember very well the Sunday morning when we received this letter. My best friend was with us at the time, and we jumped up for joy. We really didn't know what had hit us. And immediately after that, we started making preparations to leave.
Our papers were, I wouldn't exactly say forged, but certainly there was some skedaddlery going on. For my brother and I, their papers were for a married couple.
I did not find out anything about him until about the mid-1990s. We thought until then that we'd been issued a visa by mistake and only hoped that somebody else wasn't suffering as a result.
I found out when somebody was researching my husband's story and we discovered the papers. That was when we found out that it had been stamped by Frank Foley.
Frank Foley returned to Britain in 1939. His brave and selfless behaviour remained a largely untold secret until his death in 1958.
Of my own family that did not emigrate, none survived. So we were really very, very lucky. As far as I'm concerned, Frank Foley is my saviour and my saint.
Not everyone can be a Frank Foley and save tens of thousands of lives, but during the Holocaust, acts of humanity took huge amounts of courage. Each gesture a defiance against the prevailing ideology. Joan Salter and Sola Lewis are here today because of such gestures.
My name is Joan Salter. As foreign Jews living in Paris, my family were required to register weekly at the local police station. On a hot July day, my mother, older sister, and I waited our turn in the queue to register. My sister started tugging on my dress, demanding Mother put me down and pick her up instead. I started crying, my sister continued whining, and the official screamed at my mother to remove us from the office. Terrified, my mother waited outside until everyone else had registered. Timidly, she approached another policeman, a much more kindly man, and he warned my mother that we were to be rounded up and deported early the next morning. That night, the resistance smuggled us out of Paris in the back of a laundry van. That act of kindness by a very brave man saved our lives. Sadly, I recently came across a report which said that 33 policemen had been shot for helping Jews escape that Paris roundup. Thank you.
My name is Sirla Lewis. During the war, I was a young child growing up in Belgium. My father was deported to a French labor camp and finished up in Auschwitz, where he was killed. My mother and I were forced into hiding in Antwerp. At first, we stayed with Marie Arkens, a devout Catholic who lived opposite the Gestapo headquarters. We were later taken in by Betty and Jean-Louis Lim in Ghent. Though we were complete strangers to them, they hid us in their home, along with a British airman and a member of the resistance movement. In hiding Jews, Marie Arkens and the Lim family knew they were risking their lives to help us. My mother and I stayed with the family for 18 months and were not discovered, and we survived the war. After I came to live in England, I was determined that the bravery of those who saved us should be recognized. On 10th September 1997, Yad Vashem posthumously honored the Lim family and Marie Arkens. They were righteous among the nations.
The Nazis didn't want just to exterminate the Jews, but to obliterate all traces of what had been vibrant and flourishing Jewish life and communities. And clinging on to their sense of identity, preserving Jewish culture and recording Nazi crimes became acts of resistance.
David Graeber was a young man living in the Warsaw Ghetto, one of 400,000 Jews crammed into an area of less than 1.5 square miles, imprisoned behind 10-foot-high walls, topped with barbed wire and guarded 24 hours a day. 83,000 people died of hunger and cold. Unable to pay burial taxes, many families were forced to leave bodies where they lay in the streets. Despite these appalling conditions, where simply getting through every day took a huge amount of strength, a small group looked beyond the daily struggle to the future. Aged only 19, David Graeber was among them. David and his colleagues met secretly on the Sabbath, led by the historian Emanuel Ringelblum. They collected thousands of items, diaries, letters, official papers, and the fragments of everyday life. And the fragments of everyday life such as tram tickets and sweet wrappers. The aim was to create a secret archive documenting the way Jews were treated in the ghetto. The Cultural and Historical Archive was codenamed Oneg Shabbat, meaning the pleasures of the Sabbath. In the summer of 1942, mass deportations took place from the ghetto to the extermination camp at Treblinka. For David and his fellow activists, it became imperative to preserve the archive for a future they may not live to see. The precious documents were stored in milk churns and boxes, and then buried in 3 separate locations in the ghetto. After the war, 2 of the 3 milk churns were discovered, and found amongst the papers was David Graeber's last testament.
I would love to live to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and shriek to the world, proclaiming the truth, so the world may know all. So the ones who did not live through it may be glad, and we may feel like veterans with medals on our chest. We would be the fathers, the teachers, and the educators of the future. But no, we shall certainly never live to see it, and therefore do I write my last will. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world to what happened and what was played out in the 20th century. We may now die in peace. We fulfilled our mission. May history attest for us.
David Graeber died in the Warsaw Ghetto at some point after writing this testament on the 3rd of August 1942. He was just 19.
The Warsaw Ghetto was the place of heroic acts of armed resistance. In response to the deportations and threats to crush the remaining population, the starving and weakened Jews of Warsaw rose up against the Nazi oppressors. With only a small number of weapons smuggled into the ghetto, they fought against the organized and well-equipped SS and police units. For 4 extraordinary weeks, they held out. But in the end, they paid a heavy price for their resistance. 7,000 died during the fighting. A further 50,000 were captured and sent to forced labor and extermination camps. The ghetto was finally liquidated. A small number of Jews evaded the Nazis and joined partisan groups. They carried out acts of sabotage against the occupying regime. And the song they sang found its way into the ghettos and even the death camps themselves. Throughout Europe, persecuted Jews sang an anthem of resistance.
Sag nicht einmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleine, verstellen bleine. Kommen wird noch unser Reis gewinnt so. Es wird abheugt und unser Trott, wir sind da. Kommen wird noch unser Reis gewinnt so. Es wird abheugt und unser Trott, wir sind da. Von grünen Palmenland bis weißem Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Im Wohl gefallen sie spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unsere Geburt, unser Mut. Im Wohlgefallen ist spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unsere Geburt, unser Mut. Es wird die Morgensonne begilden uns dem Heind. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Nur heute versammeln wird die Sonne mit dem Kajor. Wie ein Paroll soll gehen das Lied von dort zu dort. Nur heute versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie ein Paroll soll gehen das Lied von dort zu dort. Komm, sag nicht keinmal, lass die Geist dem letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleiene, verstellen bleiene. Komm, noch nicht unser Ausgebete schon. Sveta pojk von unser Flott, wir sind da. Kommen weg von unser Ausgebete schon. Sveta pojk von unserer Flott, wir sind da.
The Holocaust was unprecedented and shook the very foundations of civilization, and the world's response was never again. Yet genocides have happened again and again and again, killing people purely because of their faith or community they belong to, often with the active involvement of the state. Since the Second World War, genocides have taken place in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and is ongoing in Darfur, a region west of Sudan. The testimony you are about to hear is that of a young woman whose family are from the Fur tribe of black Africans who have suffered in the Darfur genocide. The Sudanese government have supported Arab militia known as Janjaweed, who have destroyed hundreds of villages and murdered thousands of people. And she is so afraid of reprisals against her family who are still in Darfur that she cannot appear this evening, but she's asked for her story to be read on her behalf.
In the summer of 2004, I was working in Khartoum when I heard news that my father had been killed and my mother had been kidnapped when the Janjaweed attacked our village. When I found out what had happened, I went with my fiancé to my village. Whilst we were there, the Janjaweed came back. My fiancé and I were attacked. They chased us on a horse, and we were shot at several times, and he was killed. I was shot in my leg. I waited 4 hours with my fiancé after he was killed, with his head on my lap, until somebody came to help me. A year later, I received an anonymous call at my personal office. A man asked me why I had been the year before at my home village. At that time, the government was looking for people who might be activists living in Khartoum. I was being watched inside my own office, but I didn't realize it. In the summer of 2006, I was walking along the street near to where I lived when 3 men jumped out of a pickup truck, grabbing me and forcing me into the vehicle. I was taken into an office where the head man was. He told me it is only prostitutes who work with rebels. I said to him, I am not a rebel and I am not a prostitute either. A man on my right hit me with the back of his gun and told me not to talk to the boss like that. They said the money I sent to my family in Darfur was going to support the rebels. I told them I was not sending any money to any rebels. I'm just someone with a broken heart who is looking after my family. The man in charge said he wanted to examine me to see if I was a prostitute. So I was taken to a small room, which was full of dried blood on the floor. The boss started to remove my clothes. I tried to resist, but he was too strong, and he stabbed me in the breast and the palm of my hand with a knife. I tried to escape, but 2 men stood in the door. He raped me as they watched. I was released 3 days later. At the police station, I was told no one had reported the security force before. It's better if you go away. I couldn't talk to anybody. In my culture, you cannot talk about this. In late 2007, I was detained again. I was taken from the same street in the same way as before. But this time, they were more aggressive. I was interrogated with a knife held under my chin and forced to give information about my family. I was raped by individuals as well as groups. I was beaten and tortured so badly that I have scars on my stomach, hands, and back from this. That is when I said to myself, I will never, ever let them get me a third time. 2 months later, I left Sudan for Europe. I was completely destroyed. They ruined my life.
The Darfuri singer, Sharouk Abu Nas, will now perform a special version of the song al-Yatama, Mother of Orphans, which expresses sympathy for a struggling war widow.
اليتامى بكى لما انحساب فراغ ما هي تمشي السوق مركب مصير غرام الكسر والكراس هم في عيون براء الماء بحس ما بهم الخان هموم سرى
Please welcome to the stage the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, Chief Rabbi Mervis.
If during the concluding years of the Weimar Republic, the German electorate would have placed greater confidence in democracy, then perhaps the Nazis would not have seized power. But as is well known, sometimes poverty and desperation can become the allies of the politics of hatred. If after the Nazis made the Jews into scapegoats, claiming that they were responsible forever, for everything, the German people would have said aloud, "No, this is a lie," then perhaps Kristallnacht and legislation against the Jews could have been prevented. But, unfortunately, sometimes it's just easier to be quiet while everyone around one is turning a blind eye to everything that is wrong. If the employees in the pesticide factory manufacturing Zyklon B would have turned to their employers and said, "Why are we making more of this product? Where is it going to and what is it going to be used for?" then perhaps the murderers might not have had at their disposal the means through which to carry on with their efficient killing machine. But sometimes the easiest way forward is not to ask the difficult questions. But war is complex, and it's often difficult to take critical decisions. If in the aftermath of the war, when there was a chorus of never again ringing loudly around the globe, our societies would have internalized the lessons from the Holocaust, then we could have applied them to prevent other tragedies and genocides from taking place, and so many millions of lives could have been saved. But Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, Rwanda, they seem for so many to be so far away and irrelevant. So many ifs and so many buts. 6 million precious Jewish souls perished in the midst of a sea of silence. Let us today make a commitment in the presence of Holocaust survivors and survivors of tragedies and genocides since then, that we will learn the lessons of the Holocaust and those tragedies. We will internalize that information, and in the future we will never stand idly by. Let us declare with a full heart, with much passion and total sincerity, never again. No ifs and no buts.
How do we comprehend the idea of 6 million people? If a minute's silence was held for every Jewish victim of the Holocaust, the world would be silent for more than 11 years. In the camps, human beings were reduced to numbers, stripped of humanity, stripped even of a name, identified only by a series of digits tattooed on their arms. But behind every number was an individual with a life, friends, family, likes and dislikes, hopes and aspirations.
Nusha Landau, Junior Grupstein, and Lucia Milia were young friends from Piotrków in Poland. Ordinary schoolgirls who loved to read novels and spend hours chatting. Everything changed when the deportations began, and the 3 young girls sent their photographs along with a last message to their friend Bronia, who'd already left Piotrków. Bronia survived the war and kept the photographs. Today we say their names, we see their faces, we hear their words.
Nusha wrote, "If it has to be like this, if it has to be the end, let my picture be a memento of the old days."
Lucia's last words show how aware she was of what lay ahead. It's terribly, terribly sad when young people are dying, because everything in me wants to live. Especially at such a young age, because at the age of 13, one really begins to learn about life. Perhaps it's good that it's at such an early age, I don't know. But I do not want to die.
And Junior wrote simply, "Bronia, now there will be nothing. Nothing. Only nothing. But there was so much. There could have been so much more." Of 31 classmates, just 2 survived.
A powerful reminder of the many young lives lost in the Holocaust when 1 million children were killed. The 6 candles on the stage will now be lit in memory of Jewish and other victims of the Nazis and of those murdered in genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda and Darfur. The violinist Jennifer Pike will play the theme from Schindler's List.
Elochein b'amromin Hamtzei menucha nechona al kanfei Ashechina b'malot kedoshim utaharim kezar harakia mazhirim begane eden tei menuchatam Adonai hu nachalatam veyanuchu b'shalom al mishkavam v'nomar amen.
Elie Wiesel was 16 years old when he was deported from Hungary to Auschwitz, together with his family. His mother and his youngest sister were murdered on arrival. His father died in Buchenwald days after he and Elie had arrived in the camp following a death march. Elie survived, and after the war he wrote Night, one of the best known and most haunting testimonies. In 1986, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his tireless campaigning to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and to raise awareness of other genocides. This is an extract from his acceptance speech.
I remember it happened yesterday or eternities ago. A young Jewish boy discovered the kingdom of night. I remember his bewilderment. I remember his anguish. It all happened so fast. The ghetto, the deportation, the sealed cattle car, the fiery altar upon which the history of our people and the future of mankind were meant to be sacrificed. I remember he asked his father, "Can this be true? This is the 20th century, not the Middle Ages. Who would allow such crimes to be committed? How could the world remain silent?" And now the boy is turning to me. "Tell me," he asks, "what have you done with my future? What have you done with your life?" And I tell him that I have tried to keep memory alive, that I have tried to fight those who would forget. Because if we forget, we are guilty. We are accomplices. And then I explained to him how naive we were, that the world did know and remain silent. And that is why I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe.
And with that song of hope, this Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration comes to an end. The hope that one day humanity may live up to the promises of never again, and thus truly learn from this dark chapter in our history.